Hello everyone, and welcome back to Gnome Soup. My name is Joey, and today I'll be covering Gilles Deleuze's Empiricism and Subjectivity. This video is meant to be a precursor to a future David Hume episode for the podcast. I just thought I might as well get the perspective on one of the most interesting figures in the 20th century continental persuasion, Gilles Deleuze. Now, just to be upfront, I am not a specialist on Deleuze, I am still learning. Don't think of this as a word of authority or even as a deep dive into how this connects into everything Deleuzian. I think this video could be a good reference for anyone else who's trying to read this particular book because, to be honest, the notes out there are very sparse. I don't want to keep you waiting for long, but let me just say a word or two for why I personally really enjoy this book. Empiricism and Subjectivity was the first of the little books that Deleuze wrote on various philosophers as he was trying to formulate his own way. Sometimes these books are ignored because people think Deleuze's voice overwhelms what these philosophers were trying to say, but for me, I find it to be, first of all, unavoidable, but also a signal to Nietzsche's circle of becoming. This may seem very strange at first, but if Deleuze's project is centered around life affirmation, then his method will be to find the elements within a philosopher's work that supports this and emphasizes them, and allows them to continue into the rest of his work. And like I said, I think this is probably an unavoidable aspect of thought, is that we take certain elements that, which we vibe with the most and allow these aspects to expand into how we act. As for the actual material in Empiricism and Subjectivity, I love Deleuze's entire idea that a subject emerges from what appears to be lifeless atoms. You know that saying from Jurassic Park, life finds a way, and it's this aspect that I believe Deleuze really wants to emphasize is immanent becoming. It's a beautiful concept and picture, and I'm really excited to see how this might be reflected in his future work. Just a warning though, before you jump knee-deep into this video, you should be familiar with David Hume's empiricism. This isn't exactly meant for beginners. You might want to read the treatise. That I think that's the source that Deleuze uses for this entire book. But yeah, without further ado, let's just jump straight into this. Chapter 1. The Problem of Knowledge and Ethics. Deleuze first establishes Hume's project. Before Hume can be a psychologist, he must first be a moralist and a sociologist. Deleuze makes the claim that Hume cannot create an account of a psychology without first studying what affects the mind. The conception here of psychology is that of a timeless study of the faculties, or the form of human subjectivity which applies across all time. But as we'll come to see, faculties are what emerge from affections of the mind. Putting it in my own words, form is what emerges. Deleuze says, quote, "By itself and in itself, the mind is not nature. It is not the object of science." End quote. The central question for Deleuze when considering Hume is, how does the subject emerge from the given? From the soup of atoms which constitute the human, how does subjectivity emerge? How does the mind become human nature? Something that we'll see is how the understanding emerges from the imagination. The role of the understanding is to make the passions sociable and to make individual particular interests general. Ideas are the given. They are the collections which make up the mind. They are what Hume describes as, quote, "the theater without a stage," end quote. At this point, the subject has not emerged from the given, the mind. As of now, the imagination is simply a collection and not yet a faculty. At this time, the imagination is whimsical, without constancy and uniformity. Before the imagination becomes a faculty, it is in a state of delirium and madness. Ideas are not connected to each other, and it is only chance which clashes them together to make fantastical pictures. What makes the imagination into a faculty? It's the principles of association, contiguity, resemblance, and causality. These principles transcend the imagination, but are also distinct from the imagination. Deleuze says that the principles of association are not derived from the imagination, but are a force which finds its objects in the imagination. They are not qualities of ideas, but separate. They are qualities of human nature. This is important. Human nature transcends the given. Deleuze says, quote, "Through belief and causality, the subject transcends the given. Literally, the subject goes beyond what the mind gives it. I believe what I have neither seen nor touched." End quote. The principles of association are what give the imagining constancy to turn it into a faculty. Together, these principles make possible belief through which we can affirm existence. Deleuze points out the contrast with transcendentalism. It is not the mind that transcends human nature, but human nature which transcends the mind. The imagination becomes a part of human nature, but the important point to notice is that it only becomes human nature once it has gone through the process of becoming a faculty. Notice how this harkens back to what was said at the beginning of this chapter. One must first study the affects of the mind before one can become a psychologist. But here we have a tension. One could ask, how should we consider the imagination when it is regulated by the principles of association as human nature, but not the principles of association as human nature? After all, it seems as if the organizing force, which is doing the work, so why should we not consider these as being principally human, rather than the result of this clashing, which is the regulated imagination? Shouldn't these laws be considered human nature? Deleuze says that the principles of association are like any other law of nature, defined by its effects and not its causes. Since the regulated imagination is what we observe and experience, we can only consider the principles of association by their effects. Principles work on the mind, but human nature works on the regulated imagination. But continuing on, once the principles of association have affected the mind and the imagination becomes regulated, that is, once the imagination has become human nature, now ideas are able to be related to one another. So you think of one idea, and now you can reference other ideas as well. Despite this relational process, ideas do not take on new qualities. Deleuze points out how for Hume, a general idea is always just a particular idea which has been imagined to represent more than the content from which it was derived. In other words, even though human nature works from a regulated imagination, it still has, quote, fancy, or the ability to take relations of association, form general rules, and go beyond the limits of knowledge. The regulated imagination can, in other words, still be silly. This brings us to the realization that there must be some sort of corrective rule which can rein back the silliness of the imagination. Even still, Deleuze notes, the imagination will utilize any relations and rules within its reach to reinforce its silliness. The mind is something that feels effects. Causality, says Deleuze Hume, is something felt. It is not a conclusion of the understanding. The idea of necessity, that something necessarily follows from another, is not present in an object. We only have constant conjunction. Remember this. The subject is not active in Hume's world, but is something that happens. So Hume's study of human nature is divided between a psychology of simple elements, atoms, and the psychology of disposition, a science of affections, associationism, and practice. And now we come to the problem of knowledge. What does knowledge do? It is a transcendence of going beyond what is immediate before a person. Deleuze says, quote, Caesar is dead, the sun will rise tomorrow, Rome exists, end quote. These are general claims and beliefs we make in practice. However, there is a contradiction between how we act and the state of knowledge. The state of knowledge is such that ideas are general representations of particular impressions. The state of knowledge is that we infer relations between objects which don't inherently exist within the objects. Deleuze says, quote, the fact is that these practices cannot be expressed in the form of an idea without the idea becoming immediately contradictory, end quote. The resolution to this contradiction between knowledge and action is important. What's at stake is the psychology of the mind. On one hand, we transcend by acting. Subjectivity emerges from the interplay of associations acting upon the mind, and this is what Deleuze calls a true psychology. A false psychology, on the other hand, presumes that the subject pre-exists practice, and this will lead into the crippling contradiction apparent between knowledge and practice. This, says Deleuze, is Hume's method. When Hume critiques an idea and shows us its contradiction, he shows how in its place there is an affection of the mind which causes us to act. The act of transcending the given is negatively related to the idea. And it's here where Deleuze throws in a critique of representationalism. Representationalism is in contrast with relations, which is an act of the subject. Representationalism expects ideas to be able to stand for things which cannot be experienced. Things like the generality of ideas, outside experience, terms such as always, universal, necessary, and true. It is through practice and habit that these terms emerge. Deleuze, speaking through Hume, says, quote, "Rationalism has transferred mental determinations to external objects, taking away thereby from philosophy the meaning and the intelligibility of practice and of the subject." End quote. Deleuze claims that just as we make a distinction between atoms and association, we also need to distinguish between the different sorts of ideas. Impressions of sensation are an origin of ideas, but impressions of reflection are qualifications of the mind and the effects of principles. Deleuze says, quote, "The essence and destiny of empiricism are not tied to the atom, but rather to the essence of association. Therefore, empiricism does not raise the problem of the origin of the mind, but rather the problem of the constitution of the subject. Again, the subject is something that happens. It is an effect of the mind by principles that transcend its constitution." Quote, "The mind is not subject, it is subjected." End quote. The mind can only apprehend a self when it is qualified, but here is a problem for Hume, notices Deleuze, a seeming contradiction. If the mind is just a collection of the atoms or ideas and impressions, and if the subject is the mind qualified through external principles, and if the self is the apprehension of myself as united experience, then how do we get this apprehension of the self from the subject? We get the infamous admittance of defeat from Hume in the appendix of the treatise. Quote, "In short, there are two principles, which I cannot render consistent, nor is it in my power to renounce either of them. That all our distinct perceptions are distinct existences, and that the mind never perceives any real connection among distinct extension." End quote. It seems as if this unity must pre-exist for the possibility of experience, which is exactly what Kant formulates in his transcendental unity of apperception. Again, we will return to this in more detail, but hint, it's through practical activity that the subject can be apprehended. Now, recall that belief is for Hume a feeling of expectation, which guides our understanding in the world. Also recall that sympathy is a way to extend the mind past one's present and immediate interests. The principles of association create general rules of understanding, just as the passions create a consistency. All these together make possible a practical and moral activity which Deleuze says, quote, "gives history its meaning," end quote. But Deleuze warns us of sectioning the understanding and the passions off from each other. Instead, they are of the same piece to the point where Deleuze says, quote, "History must be construed as a physics of humanity," end quote. It's through the practice of belief that we can have understanding, and it's through a theory of morals that we can have society. To emphasize the point, quote, "Everywhere in Hume, the only possible practice is a theory of practice," end quote. Deleuze circles back around. But why should there be a problem with all of this in the first place? What is the problem that the treatise is addressing? For there to be a problem, there must be something within the domain of reason that escapes it. The problem is the position which reason occupies in philosophy in relation to the passions. Deleuze repeats a line from Hume, quote, "'Tis not contrary to reason to prefer the destruction of the whole world to the scratching of my finger," end quote. Recall that passions are original existences. They do not contain any representative qualities, but ideas do, and as such, ideas can be compared to each other. Reason is the comparison of ideas to tell us which ideas contradict each other, which ideas can lead to other ideas, but it does not inform us of the desirability of ends. Only the passions can do this. Reason is impotent in its ability to move to action. Thus, the conclusion that this destruction of the world is preferable to the scratching of a finger is not sufficient to lead us to action. Deleuze Hume says that moral distinctions are not made through reason. Morality moves or inhibits action. There would be a contradiction disregarding the laws of property or promises, but it's only a contradiction if they exist in nature. Quote, Reason can always be brought to bear, but it is brought to bear on a pre-existing world and presupposes an antecedent ethics and an order to ends." End quote. Reason does not account for any type of emergence. Deleuze personifies reason. Reason is rejected a primary place in practice, and so it seeks to find its position. Since it is denied a primary spot within the passions, it asserts itself from the inside, where even then it is contradicted by trying to establish itself without relying on passions in practice. This emerges as madness and skepticism. Despite this state of the mind, which results during reflection, a person still acts. A person is still able to, as Deleuze puts it, play backgammon. The state of madness and skepticism also implies a positivism of the passions. Although reason eats itself, the understanding is utilized for practice. Quote, "The positivism of the understanding is conceived in the image of the skepticism of reason." End quote. From here, we can distinguish between the system of morality and the system of the understanding. Through belief, one is able to transcend the given, which is in a state of madness, which, if it lacked belief, the subject would not be able to act. It follows that the primary study of the understanding unfolds from how a subject transcends the given by making inference. But the system of morality is totally different. We don't infer that an action is virtuous because it pleases. Quote, "This action pleased me and so it must be virtuous," which presupposes that virtue exists prior to us and must infer its existence through feelings. But rather, an action is virtuous because of how it feels, whereas morality does not rely on inference, instead working from the immediacy of the feeling. The understanding relies on a small collection from which it must infer general laws. The feelings of morality are partial. Literally, imagine it like a person saying, "I am partial towards honey and not sugar and tea." They are not extensive like the understanding, which must transcend the given. Therefore, the mission of morals is to orient the partial passions to being social. General rules for morality are different than the general rules of the understanding. This is the adjective and verb which you must remember for this book. Man is an inventive species. The next chapter will examine the process of the invention of artificial values. Chapter 2. Cultural World and General Rules. Sympathy is the way by which individuals can transcend their individual partialities and live within general rules. But the issue with sympathy is that, while it does create a moral space for us to fill with characters whom we care for, this moral space is limited by our particular interests. The flip side of this is caring too widely, which misses the particular characters which surround a person. Quote, "We condemn the parents who prefer strangers to their own children." End quote. Human nature is not in morality. Morality is in human nature. Deleuze Hume criticized egoism as the basis of human nature, saying that it is too simplistic. Human beings are more partial than they are egotistic. After all, the state of nature for Hume is one where people are born into society. If egoism was human nature, then the organization of society would require the limitation of egos. This is what Deleuze Hume criticizes in contractional theories where society is defined in a negative, limiting way. But suppose sympathy was in human nature. Society, then, is a matter of extending sympathy into a more general whole from their partialities. Within this notion, society is a collection of invented norms which further the interests of all involved. The problem for society, then, is not limitation but integration. Quote, "Such an integration implies a positive moral world and is brought about by the positive invention of such a world." End quote. Esteem is the integration of sympathies and the basis of justice in a society. You could think of esteem as limitless sympathy. The question for this chapter is, how is sympathy extended? Well, first let us re-emphasize the difference between morality and nature. The sympathies are naturally given to us, nature, but these are not enough to create morality. The partials must be assembled into a whole. Remember, humans are an inventive species. We create justice. Justice is an invented rule to organize. Quote, The moral world is the system of means which allow my particular interest and also the interest of the other to be satisfied and realized. Morality may equally well be thought of as a whole in relation to parts and as a means in relation to ends. End quote. The moral is political, and the political in turn determines the psychological. Deleuze says that the great inventors are not Asclepius and Bacchus, but rather Romulus and Theseus. So, we have a system of directed means, a determined whole, which we call a rule or norm. The function of this rule is to establish a common point of view, independent of our particular interests. Deleuze notes, even if this rule doesn't feel as strongly as our particular interests, it at least presents itself as a third interest, a value, which can be appealed to. This rule, we can observe, is both extensive and corrective. It is corrective by way of chastising individual interests to align with the general interest. Sympathies are presented with a dilemma. Either they choose a way to reconcile themselves with other sympathies, they must find a way to extend themselves past their particular interests, or they must eliminate each other. It is from this dilemma, then, that artifice provides the sympathies the means to expand past their boundaries. Deleuze says, quote, passions are not limited by justice. They are enlarged and extended. Justice is the extension of the passions and interest, and only the partial movement of the latter is denied and constrained. End quote. The dualism in Hume's work is not between reason and affection, nature or artifice. It is between what Deleuze calls the whole of nature and the mind it is affected by this whole. Nature and culture are what form the whole. Just because morality does not exist in instinct nor in nature does not mean it cannot come to be. And these invented artifacts are not contrary to the passions, but allow the passions to attain their ends. Quote, nature does not reach its ends except by means of culture, and tendency is not satisfied except through the institution. End quote. Remember, humans are an inventive species. Deleuze paraphrases Bergson. Quote, habits are not themselves natural, but what is natural is the habit to take up habits. End quote. So Hume's critiques are focused on three notions. 1. The proposition that artificial values such as justice are derived from instinct, because this gives us a false sense of nature. 2. Against that, institutions such as politics, education, and commerce are what define virtue. This is because this notion chokes the true potential of culture. And 3. Criticism against an egoist-centered humanity which Deleuze calls an empty science of humanity, uncultivated and abstract, without history and without difference. At the same time as Hume introduces sympathy, he also introduces other motives to interest, many of which are contradictory. Motives such as prodigality, ignorance, heredity, custom, habit, greed, luxury, abundance. Hume's account is contrary to the rational man of Homo economicus. Whereas the law is restrictive and negation, Hume's institution is expansive. Quote, anything positive is taken away from the social, and instead the social is saddled with negativity, limitation, and alienation. This, Deleuze claims, is the motivation for Hume's criticism of egoist-centered states of nature, social contracts, and natural rights. Hume goes in another direction with institutions. Rather than the law being primary, the law is derived from utility. There was a need for the law to come into being. Quote, utility is on the side of the institution. The institution, unlike the law, is not a limitation, but rather a model of actions, a veritable enterprise, an invented system of positive means, or a positive invention of indirect means. End quote. Necessity belongs outside of the social institution. Out there belongs the law. For Deleuze, Hume's institutions presents an opportunity for creative difference which does not exist within the law. So in society, you have conventions founded on utility, which is contrary to a notion of obligations founded on a contract. This is the part, however, where Deleuze distinguishes between society and nature. Despite being intimately connected, society is still an invention, and it cannot be reduced to nature. And this makes sense from what has been said. Society is an invention to allow the passions to be satiated while at the same time expanding the horizon of the passions to achieve more than they could outside of society. To reduce all of this down to the functionalist interpretation of utility overlooks the creative, assertive aspect of society whose development follows the satiation of necessity. Deleuze says, quote, "The institution, being the model of actions, is a designed system of possible satisfaction." Deleuze also says this, "An institution exists when the means by which a drive is satisfied are not determined by the drive itself or by specific characteristics." In other words, although necessity was the drive which drove the institution into being, the aims of the institution are able to divert away from the origins from which it emerged. If it was the case that institutions were identical with necessity, then there is no possibility for difference. History is the account of particular institutions which, although they shared the same drive of necessity, they diverged in their purposes. Quote, "The drive is general. It does not explain the particular, even when it clearly finds in the particular the form of its satisfaction." What is it then that describes the essence of the institution? Deleuze Hume says, "It is the reflection of the drive and the imagination in accordance with the circumstances." What this means is that need does certainly drive, but this drive is mediated within the imagination. A society is located in a certain circumstance with all its peculiarities and particularities. The principles of association act within the imagination and determine the drive according to the circumstance. This explains the diversity of institutions, which exist as well as distinguishes institutions from necessity. Deleuze says, quote, "The satisfaction of human drives is related, not to the drive itself, but rather to the reflective drive." End quote. Yet even though sympathy has been extended, the vivacity of sympathy still seems to be lacking without another variable. Quote, "The question is no longer how to distribute, but how to reinforce and enliven justice." End quote. Since we know institutions like property are determined by the imagination in the form of general rules and possible circumstances, how do these general rules and possible circumstances apply to real persons? Real persons meaning particular people in grounded particular situations. The mechanism of government, then, is to make general distant interests apply to the present and particular interests through the use of rewards and punishments. Quote, "The nearest must become the most distant, and the most distant the nearest." End quote. It's in this way where the government is powered through belief. Social contract theory is again criticized because it is not through representation of members, a promise by which government is founded, but through the belief of its members in the general interest. Law is an effect of institutions. Quote, "The state, according to Hume, is not charged with representing the general interest, but rather with making the general interest an object of belief." End quote. The last few pages of this chapter is the description of how government, property, the general interest, and belief are all reconciled within commerce. If workers are compelled to toil and produce in excess beyond what they need, it will be very difficult to maintain this in the long run. However, with manufacturers and commodities, the worker both maintains and reproduces the general interest. While Deleuze doubts that capitalism at this time only slightly recognized that the interests of the landowner, the capitalist, and the worker differed, and which would require a different approach, he wants to look at the idea that would maintain that they are the same. Property, since it is rare, depends upon government. Money is only an effect. Note this important point here. Deleuze says, quote, "We could say that the essential, or perhaps the only theme of Hume's economic essays is to show that the effects which we ordinarily attribute to the quantity of money depend in fact on other causes. What is concrete in this economy is the idea that economic activity involves a qualitative motivation." End quote. Chapter 3. The Power of Imagination in Ethics and Knowledge. Deleuze says that the general rule is both extensive and reflective. The passions are extended because they are reflected, just as an explicit reminder of what it means for the imagination to reflect the passions. The passions are reflected in the imagination when the immediate particular feeling and object associated with that feeling are detached and applied into possibility. Hume says that there are two types of rules that are non-identical: determining and corrective rules. Determining rules are more extensive because people often extend general rules beyond the situation from which they arose. With determining rules, there are no exceptions. The accidental is conflated with the general. On the other hand, corrective rules are more reflective because they correct the extension of determining rules. These corrective rules actually side with the accidental than determining rules do. Corrective rules stand for all possible cases. So here's an issue that needs to be figured out then. Extension and reflection are identical because, remember, the passions are extended because they are reflected, but there also seems to be a difference between them by way of corrective and determining rules. They share the same origin, so how can they both be different and identical at the same time? One must remember that the reflection of the passions takes place in the imagination. So really, the general rule is passion reflected in the imagination. What this means is that the general rule provides the passions the possibility of transcending the limits of their own instantiation. In other words, it may have been that the passions were boxed within the space of their immediate sensory. But now, with the introduction of culture and the general interest, the passions have all of a sudden been granted a new ripe field in which to express themselves. By reflecting the passions in the imagination first produces determining rules, but when cases do not match up, the imagination must produce corrective rules which stand for the accidental. They are different stages in the imaginative process of passions being reflected in the imagination. Quote, "In reflection, the passions imagine themselves, and the imagination becomes passionate." End quote. From the imagination becoming passionate, Deleuze describes three types of rules that transcend their particularity: taste, freedom, and duty. It must be remembered, as Deleuze says, quote, "Rules reflect processes and ideas of practice." End quote. All of these rules emerge from practice, habituation, by being present in the world. The first one is the rule of taste. How does a particular feeling transcend its immediacy to become an aesthetic judgment? By way of corrective rules, the imagination provides possibility, and it is within this possibility that a particular feeling is able to transcend into an aesthetic judgment. Deleuze reminds the reader of Hume's idea of tragedy, where spectators gain pleasure from horrific scenes. Deleuze says, quote, "Aesthetics is the science which envisages things and beings under the category of power or possibility." End quote. At the same time that a person watches a horrific scene transpire, the imagination is filled with these passions. But the infinite play of the imagination and possibility reconfigures the passions, so it's possible to feel pleasure. The rule of freedom is very short, but it goes like this. First, the problem. How does a person have an idea of free will if they are moved with every sensation? How does the will transcend the immediacy of sensation to be able to navigate apart from external sensory forces? The answer. The will is a passion. As a passion, the will is reflected in the imagination. Recall what this means. If a passion is reflected in the imagination, the passion and the object to which the passion is attached are separated within the imagination in a field of possibility. This means the passion and the will are given several avenues of possibility in which it can be applied, so hence the feeling of the rule of the will is possible. Now, how about the rule of duty? Deleuze gives an example of how this might develop. And don't be mistaken, the example is misogynistic, but Deleuze does note it's misogyny. It's an example and not an endorsement. A man feels jealous and uncertain about the activities of his wife. These passions become reflected in the imagination, and material consequences take place. A woman's duty is to take on the virtues of chastity, modesty, and decency. So to sum this all up, Deleuze thinks general rules are resonances of affections of the mind and imagination. He repeats himself, quote, "Rules reflect processes and ideas of practice," end quote. And this notion really emphasizes his idea of subjectivity. Subjectivity is something that happens to someone. It is not free-floating. It emerges through placement in the given and does not precede the given. Subjectivity is an effect. Deleuze modifies the simplicity of the model of subjectivity in the first chapter. Subjectivity and the faculties, such as imagination, emerge from the mind being affected, but the affection does not stop there. The imagination now reflects the effects of the affecting principles, and one way by which this manifests is by way of general rules. Far from the imagination being fixed, the imagination continues being silly. Deleuze says, quote, "The fancy is re-established in the principles of its own transformation, for at least something within the affections escape all reflection." End quote. Deleuze says this phrase, quote, "That which defines the real exercise of the affections, the actuality of their limits, and the action by means of which affections fix the mind in specific forms is precisely that which, without contradiction, allow itself to be reflected." End quote. This is a mouthful, but what this means is that passions we feel in particular moments at first constrain these passions within that particular moment and thing. But when those passions are reflected within the imagination, they are freed from those limits. Quote, "Imagination, as it reflects on the form of its own stability, liberates these forms and liberates itself from them. It extends them infinitely." End quote. As soon as a passion is reflected within the imagination breaks down these boundaries that constrained passion and the object, and suddenly a whole new field of possibility opens up for the passion and object to be placed within. Imagination necessarily transforms and extends the passions. Note this. This process explains the conundrum presented at the beginning of this chapter, where it is asked how contradicting rules derive from the same origin. It is by this infinite creation and destructive process of the imagination where the two rules of determination and correction are united. This process also creates the illusion of the fancy. Since limits are being played with by the imagination, this grants power to certain things. Quote, "The power of the imagination is to imagine power." End quote. So when unrestrained by the understanding, objects of experience are disconnected by a causal chain and, in a sense, inherit their own first causes. Nevertheless, these two are still distinct even though they are in a union. After all, it will be a reflection of a reflection. Consequent reflections will change the first order that was established. It is not enough to think about artifice only in terms of the imagination. Deleuze says, quote, "The distinction between nature and culture is precisely the distinction between simple and complex effects." The interest that Hume shows in animals is that, unlike humans and their cultures, the affections on animal minds yield only simple effects. So culture is serious, meaning it has general rules which are not wild like the imagination while deriving from the silly. But how do we explain this union? How does nature transition into culture? Before reflection of the passions, the imagination has already been formalized. It cannot be that the imagination is settled by some qualities inherent in its ideas, so there must be some other principle of nature, that is, the modes of association which are responsible for giving solidity. When Deleuze says that, quote, "This is the reason why the rule determines itself," end quote, he's providing a description of how nature and general rules clash together to form a regulating and continuous logic for maintaining and reproducing itself. This is, Hume says, where judgment and understanding come into play. It is in the imagination where the principles of association work to create rules. In aesthetics, the imagination seamlessly transitions from idea to idea to provide a picture of unity. In rules of property, the rules of association are used as illustrated in Deleuze's example of the hunted rabbit who rightfully belongs to the hunter because of the proximity and causal chain of events, or the right of property of a sea bay to a certain nation instead belonging to a certain nation across the ocean. The imagination establishes rules, and it is from these rules where culture is determined. This is how nature transitions into culture. Deleuze says, quote, "The illusion of the fancy is the reality of culture," end quote. The rules which govern culture are merely specious, merely plausible, and not strictly necessary. From the point of view of the understanding, culture is an illusion, but this shouldn't mean it should dissipate the territory that belongs to the imagination. The understanding's role is to step in when imagination overextends itself to consider general rules as absolute rules, if we give real existence to general rules. Now Deleuze asks the question, what is the relation between the passions and the imagination such that the passion allows the passions to develop a complex effect? Modes of association give ideas relations, but passions give them weight. Additionally, the imagination moves from the present to the future. The passions need associations for possibility, and associations need passions for direction. The passions, together with circumstance and through the reflection of the imagination, create general rules which extend beyond the tendency of the present. Quote, on one hand, the possible becomes real, but on the other, the real is reflected. End quote. And this is an opportunity for Deleuze-Hume to provide elaboration on his idea of subjectivity. The subject is not a quality, but a qualification of a collection of ideas. The collection is affected by principles of nature within the imagination to form a partial subject. From here, reflection of the imagination constitutes the subject by way of general rules. Contrary to a notion that holds a subject to be representational, Hume's subject is instead constructed. Subjectivity allows the transcendence from particularities, and that this allows the possibility of multiple subjects living with each other. The idea of the subject is incomprehensible within the understanding, but it finds a solution within culture. But now Deleuze transitions into a new section. This section concerns the relation of reason to imagination. First, Deleuze reminds us that whereas practical reason is concerned with producing a whole of culture and morality, theoretical reason is, quote, the determination of the detail of nature, that is, of parts submitted to calculation. End quote. Practical reason is possible through the schema of the imagination. The properties of the imagination are as follows. Reflection, the ability to vary the order of passions in relation to their associated objects. Excessive extension, basically the ability to be silly with limits. And the property of being quasi-constitutive of subjectivity, meaning the imagination has the property of being the organizer of experience, but it still requires more. How does theoretical reason determine the parts of human nature? The affects which give rise to practical reason emerge from practice within culture. This is how the schema of the imagination comes about. Practical reason tries to create a nice cohesive picture, whereas theoretical reason holds up bits of this whole to examine them in terms of parts. The objects which concern theoretical reason are divergent from those of practical reason, so there must be a different schema which arises a different way from the imagination. The first thing to be reminded of is that the imagination needs the principles of association to fix itself in place, but the principles of association themselves need nothing to stabilize themselves. Instead, they are calm and operate in the back of the mind. Remember, the development of the imagination is a gradual process. It starts fanciful, but becomes organized by the principles of association which, through habit, rules start to emerge, such as the feeling of causality. It is from this process that reason develops out of imagination. Quote, reason is imagination that has become nature. It is the totality of the simple effects of association, general ideas, substances, and relations. But now we need to distinguish between two types of reason, which emerge out of two types of relations. These two types of relations are the relation of ideas and the relation of objects. The relation of ideas uses relations such as resemblance, quantity, quality, and contrariety. The relation of objects uses relations such as time and place, identity, and causality. Relations of ideas are internal, meaning if you change the relation, the idea changes. Think of 2 plus 2 equals 4 changing to 2 plus 2 equals 5, the relation of which changes the idea. Whereas relations of objects are external, meaning you can change the relation between objects and it wouldn't change what those objects are. Think of block A and block B. The relation of distance could change between them without affecting the identity of block A and block B. The two types of reasoning proceed from these different types of relations. For the relation of ideas, you have demonstrative reasoning. For the relation of objects, you have probabilistic reasoning. Demonstrative and probabilistic reasoning both use comparison. Though they are used in different ways, they still convince on the basis of belief. Deleuze Hume corrects our idea that causality results from probabilistic reasoning. The feeling of causality develops. It is a habit that develops this feeling. Probability is the comparison of stronger feelings of causality. The point of this is to iterate again how human nature is inert without being placed in circumstances which develop habit. Quote, "Here, human nature does not by itself produce its effect." End quote. The paradox of habit is as follows. The repetition of similar events somehow creates a habit. From is, somehow we leap to will be. There is no logical connector which guarantees this leap, but somehow we act upon it. In other words, a bunch of quality is turned into a quality. It is a principle of human nature to be habitual. Deleuze says, quote, "Habit is the root of reason, and indeed the principle from which reason stems as an effect." End quote. It is not probabilistic reasoning which establishes habits. It is habits with its associations and feelings which establish probabilistic reasoning. When it comes to the relations of ideas, however, these do not need to develop from habit. Human nature is constituted in such a way where these associations are determined by principles of nature. The movement of the relation of ideas are dependent upon other ideas. These relations between these ideas are still external to each other, but Deleuze Hume's point is that, quote, "Whether as relations of ideas or as relations of objects, relations are always external to their terms." End quote. The question Deleuze now raises is, how is the understanding able to make inferences or reason about cause and effect? This will be an answer to the paradox of habit. Experience presents a person with the same phenomenon over and over again. Yet how does a person leap from the is to the will be? Deleuze says, quote, "Repetition by itself does not constitute progression, nor does it form anything. The repetition of similar cases does not move us forward, since the only difference between the second case and the first is that the second comes after the first, without displaying a new idea." End quote. It's through habit that experience yields an expectation for the future based on the past. Belief is the product of habit. This is the way by which the imagination transforms into the understanding. But an illegitimate belief can also be born from habit. Imagination is still silly. Habit may constrain imagination, but imagination will in turn mess with the limits of habit to create false experiences. This is what Deleuze Hume calls unphilosophical probability. The understanding cannot, after all, depend upon nature to provide a legitimate determination of its limits. Somehow, the understanding must correct this overextension. The understanding must re-engage with belief to correct the imagination. Illegitimate belief stems from two sources, language and the fancy. Spoken repetition reinforces and replaces actual impressions. Deleuze, quoting Hume, says, quote, "The philosopher, having spoken continuously of faculties and occult qualities, ends up believing that these words have a secret meaning, which we might discover by reflection." End quote. The liar repeats his words and believes them. Words produce a phantom of belief. The accidental is confused as the essential. Quote, "The fancy interprets the appearance of merely accidental circumstances accompanying an object as the repetition of this object within experience." So the imagination is excessive for both knowledge and morality. When the imagination exceeds morality, art is possible, not in terms of painting, dance, skill, and such, though these would certainly be byproducts, but art in terms of gaiety, frivolity, and assertiveness. Art, in this sense, is the lifeblood of culture. If culture was a mere representation of the same, a mere repetition, then it would quickly die off. It is difference which allows for the progression of culture. But this is impossible in knowledge. Quote, when knowledge is exceeded, we no longer find the positivity of art. We find only the negativity of errors and lies. End quote. Knowledge is not the basis of society. Just think back to what Deleuze Hume has said about which comes first, the institution or the law. When it comes to the excesses of the imagination and morality, a qualitative correction by way of reflection can be inflicted on a more belief to direct it in another way. But when it comes to the excesses of the imagination and knowledge, only quantitative corrections can be inflicted. Remember, in knowledge, belief is generated through habit, and this is automatic. The understanding is not reflective, unlike the imagination. So then, to fix an illegitimate belief, principles of probability must correct one's habit to make it consistent with experience. Reasoning is not transcendent from experience, but it does transcend from the past to the future. Quote, undoubtedly, the characteristic of belief, inference, and reasoning is to transcend experience and to transfer the past to the future. But it is still necessary that the object of belief be determined in accordance with a past experience. End quote. The conclusion of this chapter is as such. Rules must correct rules. Various competing principles originate from the same origin, habit. Yet habit does not guarantee that it will agree with experience. Instead, this is an ongoing process. Habit extends the imagination, yet it limits judgment. Chapter 4. God in the World. Religion brings together the four general rules, extensive and corrective rules of passions, and extensive and corrective rules of knowledge. Theism is the unity of nature, that is, the unity which derives from resemblance and causality. Polytheism is the diversity and irreducible difference of the passions. Irreducible difference of the passions meaning that all of the passions that one feels cannot be reduced into a single passion. Religion is the system of extensive rules. It is not inherent in nature, quote, rather it is a subject of historical study, end quote. Polytheism is the extension of the passions, each god reflecting the passions of humans. As an extensive rule, religious feeling oversteps the bounds of legitimacy and confuses the accidental for the essential. Idolaters are those who live artificial lives. From the extraordinary, they create their gods. They throw themselves into barbarous activities because moral acts, which are rules, are not enough. Quote, morality is joyless. After all, morality is not picturesque. Prestige belongs to vice. End quote. Theism, on the other hand, is the extension of knowledge. It is still a process of the imagination, but this time belief is generated through the word. Quote, the priests speak, and the miracles rest on human testimony. However, the miracles do not immediately manifest a reality, but claim for themselves the fitness that, generally, we are accustomed to find between testimony and reality. End quote. Or analogy is made between machine and world, where once again the accidental is counted as essential. Just as a side note here, Deleuze says something here that is extremely telling of his general method of philosophizing. Quote, why take human technical activity as the base of analogy rather than another mode of operation, no more and no less partial, such as, for example, generation or vegetation? End quote. The proofs for God by his creation as well. But then, theology varies from story to story concerning which cause is most explanatory of the world. Forgive my pronunciation here, but with Gleanthes, a perfect world is made to fit into a picture of a perfect cause, God. But this ignores complexity, such as the presence of evil. But with Demia, he acknowledges the evil in the world, and so he makes God out to be a distant and incomprehensible cause which is not privy to experience. In either case, the idea of cause is most misappropriated. Deleuze says, quote, it is evident that religion misuses the principle of causality. In fact, there is no usage of causality in religion that is not illegitimate and fictitious. There are no physical objects or objects of repetition except in the world. The world as such is essentially the unique. It is a fiction of the imagination, never an object of the understanding. Cosmologies are always fanciful. End quote. So in contrast to Kant's notion of causality, Hume's idea of causality serves two roles. Quote, the determination of the conditions of a legitimate exercise in relation to experience, and the critique of illegitimate exercise outside experience. End quote. If religion is a dual system of extensive rules, then how is it corrected? For knowledge, the testimony is weighed in experience with probability. For culture or morality, correction works by inclusion. Quote, corrective rules, instead of confounding the exception, recognize it and include it, creating thereby a theory of experience wherein all possible cases find a rule of intelligibility and get to be ordered under a statute of the understanding. End quote. Suicide, for instance, is not a transgression against a rule, but it is like any other action which is weighed in relation to other actions. Remember, settling morals is for Hume an issue of inclusion. But now, what happens when religion is corrected? Whereas certain forms of social life are reinforced after critique, such as government, justice, commerce, art, freedom, and so on, correction seems to leave nothing of religion after critique. Miracles fold into abstractions. Religion seems to disappear from culture. The corrective rules, which fix the overstepping of the imagination and knowledge, must expel all fanciful uses of causality. Deleuze says, quote, it seems that in the domain of the extension, religion keeps only frivolity and loses all seriousness. End quote. To make the imagination serious requires the reflection of the passions and the mediation of principles of association. But in religion, the principles of association have not intervened in the imagination, leaving only pure imagination and reflection. Deleuze, quote, religion, by itself, and in its other aspects, is only the fanciful usage of the principles of association, resemblance, and causality. End quote. But yet it seems religion lives on. Quote, to believe in miracles is a false belief, but it is also a true miracle. End quote. Hume says, quote, and whoever is moved by faith to assent to it is conscious of a continued miracle in his own person, which subverts all the principles of his understanding and gives him a determination to believe what is most contrary to custom and experience. End quote. Deleuze says that philosophy does not have anything to say on the origin of the principles which allow the subject to emerge, and here it is where God finds a niche. Quote, we cannot make use of the principles of association in order to know the world as an effect of divine activity, and even less know God as the cause of the world. But we can always think of God negatively, as the causes of the principles. End quote. So purpose, which gives direction, can be thought of as a guide of the principles and human nature. Quote, purpose gives us, therefore, in a postulate, the originary unity of origin and qualification. End quote. So any analogy which explains the world is partial. Reason, instinct, generation, vegetation. We can only have thoughts and not knowledge. Deleuze says that purpose in this way is more of an elan vital than a design of infinite intelligence. Elan vital, forgive my pronunciation, is a Bergsonian term that describes the non-material forces that underlie nature and is expressed by nature. Deleuze says, quote, one could object here that all order arises from a design, but that would be to suppose the problem solved, to reduce all purposiveness to an intention, and to forget that reason is but one modus operandi among others. Why an orderly system may not be spun from the belly as from the brain. End quote. At this point, it doesn't seem like the world, which is a fiction any longer. So there are two fictions of the imagination. The first is illegitimate beliefs, and the other are the beliefs that derive from outside experience. There is a third fiction of the imagination, and this is continuous existence. Despite continuous impressions being my only perception, I formulate an idea of continued existence. Pardon me, let me repeat that. Despite discontinuous impressions being my only perception, I formulate an idea of continued existence. Suppose I can constantly observe two objects side by side. It should follow that through repetition and belief, I expect these two objects to be side by side all the time. If one day I see only one of these objects, this clashes with the expectation I have developed through habit. It is through continuous existence that I can assume the other object still exists. If I did not assume continued existence, life would be a chaotic mess. But continued existence is, of course, imaginative. It transcends the knowledge of the that-there perception. It grants the object more consistency than my perceptions. At the same time, distinctive fiction existence. Distinct existence is a fiction. We affirm a causal relation between an object and our perception of that object, but we cannot do this apart from our perception. We assume the autonomous existence of an object apart from our perceptions. Deleuze here wants to make a distinction between belief in distinct continuous objects and the formation of extensive rules, because they both seem like they result from the imagination. They are both fictions of the imagination, so why should they not be the same? Quote, "The imagination always makes use of the principles which fix it, that is, of contiguity, resemblance, and causality, in order to transcend its limits and to extend these principles beyond the conditions of their exercise. Coherency leads to continuous existence, and similar appearances lead the imagination to attribute the same identity. However, unlike extensive rules which must be corrected, the belief in distinct continuous objects is an almost unthinkable maneuver. It cannot and should not be corrected. These two react very differently to reflection of the imagination." There are two other points which clarify this distinction. First, the imagination creates a general extensive law through chance accidental perceptions. Quote, "Imagination offers the understanding as a general, elaborate experience, the purely accidental content of an experience that only the senses have registered in chance encounters." End quote. On the contrary, distinct and continuous objects are not even considered by the understanding as a false experience. It's such a natural creation of the imagination that it can't undergo investigation. Distinct and continuous objects are what make possible the construction of a world. The second point to make, the distinction between general extensive laws and distinct continuous existence, is that belief in distinct continuous objects is fantasy, which becomes a part of human nature. Deleuze reminds us again about his notion of human subjectivity as it derives from Hume. Quote, "The entire sense of the principles of human nature is to transform the multiplicity of ideas which constitute the mind into a system, that is, a system of knowledge and of its objects." End quote. But mere association is not enough. Deleuze says, quote, "It is also necessary that perceptions be regarded as separate from the mind, and that impressions be in some manner torn from the senses." End quote. Distinct and continuous existence gives ideas an existence which is separate from what the senses detect. Vividness of impressions and belief do not suffice yet. Quoting from Hume, Deleuze says, quote, "The system is complete when a seeming interruption of an appearance to the senses is surpassed by the feigning of a continued being which may fill those intervals and preserve a perfect and entire identity to our perceptions." End quote. The system is complete when an identity is developed between the system and an imagined external world. Fiction is a necessity for subjectivity. Quote, "With the world, the imagination has truly become conscious." End quote. Deleuze acknowledges that distinctiveness and continuity is talked about by Hume as being the illegitimate extension of the principles of association, causality, resemblance, and continuity. But these are, Deleuze says, only characteristics of impressions. Whereas the principles of association are continually extending and correcting general rules through the imagination, understanding, and reason, distinctiveness and continuity are figments of the imagination, which are so foundational to cognition that they are treated as principles as well. To trace the process by which belief in the existence of bodies proceeds, first, identity is created of an object. The idea of time is applied to an invariable and unchanging object. Second, similar impressions are attributed to the identity. Third, the final fiction of continuous existence is attributed, which resolves the contradiction between discontinuous impressions and identity. And finally, we arrive at the antagonism between imagination and reason. Imagination convinces us of the validity of identity and of continuous existence, but this is an overstep of the principles of human nature, yet at the same time, quote, "This usage is itself a principle." End quote. Reason tells us that all of these are false and contradicting. Quote, "For the first time, the imagination is opposed as a principle, that is, as a principle of the world, to the principles which fix it, and to the operations which correct it. To the extent that fiction, along with the world, count among the principles, The principles of association encounter fiction and are opposed to it without being able to eliminate it. The most internal opposition is now established between constituted and constitutive imagination, between the principles of association and the fiction which has become a principle of nature." End quote. Fiction has become a principle and mere reflection will not regulate it. What else could possibly be included to prevent this spiral into madness? Quote, "This system is a delirium. When fiction becomes principle, reflection goes on reflecting, but it can no longer be corrected. It is thus thrown into delirious compromises, fantasy triumphs. To oppose its own nature and to allow its fantasies to be deployed has become the nature of the mind. Here, the most insane is still natural. The system is a mad delirium." Deleuze notes what Hume has done in tracing independent existence from ancient philosophy and how modern philosophy still retains these specters in the dark. The mind is madness. Quote, "As soon as extension becomes a principle, it follows its own way, and reflection follows another. Two principles which cannot destroy each other are opposed." Deleuze notes the impasse between the principles of reason and the principles of the imagination, which are also entangled. Quote, "The choice is to be made not between one or the other of the two principles, but rather between all or nothing, between the contradiction or nothingness." End quote. This is the state of madness. So the understanding cannot be separated from the imagination. Quote, "The function of the understanding to reflect on something is exclusively corrective. Functioning alone, the understanding can only do one thing ad infinitum, to correct its corrections, so that all certainty, even practical certainty, is compromised and lost." So to recap, the mind's proper state is indifference and fanciful, unconcerned with grounding principles. The imagination is unrestrained. Madness is the result of the clashing of the principles of imagination and reason, between the affecting principles and the principles of fiction. Delirium is the result of trying to reconcile these two. The only balm for this state of things is moral practice, practical activity. Quote, "Instead of referring nature to the mind must be referred to nature." End quote. It is through this activity where contradictions can be regulated through general principles. These contradictions still exist, but they make possible the possibility of acting. Chapter 5. Empiricism and Subjectivity. The question is not what is the subject, but how does process define a subject? Deleuze answers, the subject is defined by the movement through which it is developed. Subject is that which develops itself. This is an immanent activity and not transcendental, already given. The movement through which the subject arises is double. It transcends itself and it reflects upon itself. The two fundamental characteristics of human nature are inference and invention, belief and artifice. But if belief is the act of the subject to know, then invention, which is the necessary condition for sympathy, is the subject's moral act. Belief and invention, these develop a subject. Belief transcends the given. I believe things that are not there and given. I affirm more than I know. Deleuze gives example statements. Quote, "Caesar is dead. Rome did exist. The sun will rise and bread is nourishing." End quote. The question, though, is, how can I affirm this knowledge? We infer connections between the qualities of senses and the affects of phenomena. It is through this knowledge that I can posit myself as a subject. But also we are subjects of culture. We extract the qualities of particularities and use these to transcend those particular situations. So we are inventive animals. We create general, extensive rules. How do we explain these two abilities of the subject? The first of which is to infer parts of nature from other parts which are not given, and the second is to use parts of nature to create totalities of nature which are also not given. In other words, Deleuze asks, quote, "How can a subject transcending the given be constituted in the given?" End quote. The two mechanisms by which the subject transcends the given is belief and invention, which makes the given a synthesis and a system. Here, Deleuze says, is what we mean by empiricism. He says that philosophy in general has started from the faculties which make experience possible, and from there it justifies the rest of experience accordingly. A transcendental critique can occur when variables have been stripped down to the essence which make everything else possible, a plane of certainty, and then we ask, how does the given lend itself to the subject? Deleuze says, quote, Here, the critical requirement is that of a constructivist logic which finds its model in mathematics. End quote. On the other hand, an empirical critique is purely immanent. It asks, how is the subject constituted in the given? Quote, the given is no longer given to a subject. Rather, the subject constitutes itself in the given. End quote. And here we're reminded of the aims of Chapter 1, which were to show how in psychology the faculties first rely upon the affects of nature to affect how they are given shape. What is the given? Deleuze Hume says it's the flux of the sensible, the collection of impressions and images, a set of perceptions. Quote, the totality of that which appears, being which equals appearance. End quote. The imagination is not a faculty in the beginning. It begins as just a particular set of distinct impressions and images. The principle that makes experience possible is not that ideas derive from impressions, but that everything is distinguishable, which Deleuze calls the principle of difference. If a person wishes to preserve substance, they can attribute it to each individual and distinct perception. Experience is the succession of distinct impressions and ideas. This is the starting place of empiricism. Deleuze Hume maintains that the mind does not necessarily require a subject. This point is against the rationalists who maintain that a transcendental subject is necessary to provide coherence and unity for the possibility of experience. But this entire project is to show how the subject emerges from immanent experience, and in so doing, can transcend its starting point. It is unnecessary and also does not follow that from a collection of impressions and ideas, a subject stands behind it all. But also neither does the mind represent nature. Hume's criticism of John Locke's primary and secondary qualities is a direct criticism of the mind being a representation of nature. Primary and secondary qualities would imply that the mind copy-pastes features of the world directly from the objects which it perceives, since one sensation is more primary, more real than another. But perception does not sense the quality of an object being more real than another. Impressions do not guarantee that one sensation is more real than another. Impressions do not impress into the mind from nature neatly structured. The nature of impressions must be restricted, quote, to the appearance of objects to our senses, without entering into disquisitions concerning their real nature and operation, end quote. In short, the mind is not a copier, but a producer of experience, and it produces original and distinct ideas from impressions. The underlying question of these two assertions of an underlying subject and of the mind being representative of nature is how nature relates to subjectivity. In order to ask this question, you need a thinking subject who questions their judgments which derive from the organization of cognition. How do we organize in relation to the way the world, nature, really is? How does our subjectivity harmonize with nature? The materialist might say, well, the given, our collection of ideas and impressions, supposes that there first be a body. Deleuze agrees, but he gives a warning. Quote, this is true, but one must always avoid endowing, in the beginning, the organism with an organization that will come about only when the subject itself comes to mind. That is, an organization that depends on the same principles as the subject. In other words, don't go assuming that the end result explains the initial formation. This mistakes the order. Hume even accounts for a physiological process with the use of animal spirits, which is an old explanation for how the brain connects ideas. But Hume intentionally drops this explanation because, if the brain provides a physiological model applicable to the associative process, then it's only just assuming the principles which this model uses. Quote, in short, the organism and its senses do not immediately and in themselves have the characteristics of human nature or of a subject. They must acquire these somewhere else. The mechanism of the body cannot explain the spontaneity of the subject. Depending on the body is starting and ending from the same place that Deleuze Hume starts from to give their account of the emergence of subjectivity from the given. The given does not by itself do anything without principles acting upon them. Deleuze looks again at the consistency of the mind. The mind is composed of atoms. The mind does not have an infinite capacity, but is instead made up of indivisible ideas. Hume illustrates this with his sand analogy. So a moment of the mind is the reflection that traces an idea back to its smallest part. The mind is not made up of the quality of a particular idea, but from the smallest ideas. The smallest points that we perceive are sensible points, not mathematical, but neither are they physical points. What is the difference between sensible and physical points? Physical points begin extended and divisible. Mathematical points are nothing. But between these two are sensible points. Whereas physical points have extension and mathematical points have no extension. Sensible points lack extension, but yet they still have existence. Physical points would be like a red block, but a sensible point would be like the flash of the color red, which forms an indivisible atom for the mind. Extension is something that has yet to be constructed. Space is the distribution of sensible points in a certain order, and time is the perception of succession of changing objects. Quote, thus the given is not in space, the space is in the given. Space and time are in the mind. End quote. So then, the given, the mind, must be composed of two characteristics, quote, indivisibility of an element and distribution of elements, atom and structure, end quote. But what do we mean by subject? A subject occurs when the imagination, previously a collection, becomes a faculty, a system. The subject invents and believes. It is a synthesis of the mind. 3 questions will be asked. First, what does the subject look like when it believes and invents? Second, what principles constitute the subject to be able to perform these? And third, what are the stages of synthesis that occur in the mind by the subject? To begin with the first subject, what does the subject look like when it believes and invents? Deleuze uses 3 points of view. In relation to itself, in relation to the organs of the senses, and in relation to time. First, to consider time. Previously, time was viewed by the mind as a succession of objects, but now with the subject, time is considered in terms of duration, custom, habit, and anticipation. Anticipation is a game changer. It uses a feeling built up through habit to expect in the future what has occurred in the past. Deleuze says, quote, the subject at root is the synthesis of time, the synthesis of the present and past in light of the future. The synthesis of the present and past for the future is demonstrated through belief and invention. Invention through reflection of the imagination allows the subject to transcend partiality and construct general rules for multiple subjects to live together in the form of institutions. Deleuze wonders, what is it that allows for a subject to mediate its immediate interest in favor of the general interest? It's anticipation, the feeling that comes with time, and as refined and synthesized by the subject. Quote, anticipation is the synthesis of past and present brought about by habit. End quote. And speaking of institutions, which are the locations where anticipation is directed, the possession of property is a gradual process that occurs through time. A subject possesses something, and through time, habit, association, it transforms into property. But time is also applicable to belief. Belief is a vivid feeling that connects an idea through a causal chain. Habit, custom, produces belief that past events will occur in the future. It is directive of action. In short, the synthesis of time by the subject, quote, posits the past as a rule for the future, end quote. Belief, just like property, undergoes similar transformations from the given. Quote, time was the structure of the mind, now the subject is presented as the synthesis of time, end quote. The subject also has memory. Memory is the, quote, reappearance of an impression in the form of an idea that is still vivid, end quote. But memory is not a transcendence from the given. Memory simply reproduces different structures of the mind, of the given. Habit changes this. It allows for synthesis. Deleuze says something that may be confusing, but if you think about it in the terms discussed, you'll see the difference. Quote, recollection is the old present, not the past. End quote. What this confusing phrase intends to describe is the moment when a person recollects from memory. There are 2 ways this could go. The old present is like when a person freezes in place to reminisce about their past. The passion that it invokes stirs up feelings. The person is caught up and occupied with a present that occurred long ago, while the rest of the world moves on. But Deleuze distinguishes what past means in terms of time, habit, and anticipation, a synthesis of the subject. Past is that which determines, acts, prompts, and carries a certain weight. Habit is to memory as the subject is to the mind. The past, in this sense, is activating. Deleuze says something startling. Quote, habit has no need of memory. It does without it ordinarily, in one way or another. The past is not constituted in the given. It is something synthesized by the subject. This part is incredibly fascinating. If you've read Deleuze's book, Nietzsche and Philosophy, you'll know that a good portion of the book is dedicated to describing the organization of active and reactive forces, of how sickness, decadence, is a result of reactive forces turning active forces on themselves. This part will also call to mind the Nietzschean sense of memory, discipline, and punishment, the birth of the conscious, wherein memory is a harbor of resentment. This is an interesting comparison that you might consider as you're reading this book. There is one last part on this discussion of time. The past and present are not preformed givens. Like everything else, it is synthesized. Past and present are byproducts of synthesis in the following way. Experience presents a repetition of similar cases. Habit transforms the quantity into a quality through anticipation. The understanding looks through experience to look for patterns of repetition, which becomes the past. The imagination uses habit to extend into the future, and hence, belief becomes the link between the understanding and the imagination by giving weight to certain ideas over others. Time was transformed with the synthesis of the given. Now we shall move on to the second characteristic. How is the organism transformed by the given? By organism, Deleuze is just referring to the body, the actual meat part, the subject. Before the mind becomes a subject, the organism simply gathers distinctive perceptions which are not yet united. But when the subject is constituted, now there's a spontaneity of relations and dispositions. What this means for each is the following. Deleuze says that for the animal spheres to find the idea reached for, it is necessary that there be associated pathways. Remember, animal spirits is an old physiological explanation for how the mind works. What this means is that there must be a correspondence between mental and bodily associative processes. Further still, this means that once the mind transitions from being a mere collector for distinct perceptions to a synthesizing subject, the body also follows in step with the subject synthesizing and creating a seamless experience. What does this look like in flesh and blood terms? Well, there's a unity in action between mind and body. Before the constituted subject, the body and mind would be like a bird which continues to smack into a window without learning from its actions. The body betrays the mind and there is disunity. So that is the spontaneity of relations. Now for the spontaneity of dispositions, impressions are what form the mind and reflection are what form the subject. While Hume does say impressions of reflection are included in the mind, Deleuze points out how these reflections must first be formed, and these reflections are formed through the principles of subjectivity. This is because, through mere reflection alone, a new idea cannot be produced unless nature has some sort of intervening affect. Hume says, quote, "Nor can the mind, by revolving over 1,000 times all its ideas of sensation, ever extract from them any new idea, unless nature has so framed its faculties that it feels some new original impression arise from such contemplation." End quote. We're still on the question of how the spontaneity of disposition affects the body, the organism. Now that the subject reflects, the body is also a source of passions. These would include hunger, thirst, sexual desire, and so on. But there are also reflective passions, which do not derive from the body, like pride and humility, love and hatred, love between people, joy and sadness. Nature, then, does not produce passions only by itself, but also requires the movement of other causes. So then, the body is not alone in generating reflective passions. I believe Deleuze's point here is to show how the associative principles which ground and move the subject are not idealist, but also very materialistic. The mind is not separate from the body any longer. We have discussed time in the body, characteristics whose nature changes when the subject emerges from the given. Finally, we can talk about how the mind changes with the constitution of the subject. What process constitutes the subject in the mind? It is the principles of human nature. Principles of human nature include principles of association and principles of passions, which Deleuze says can be presented in the general form of the principle of utility. By the compulsion of the principle of utility, the subject pursues an end, and it organizes means in pursuit of this end. One way in which it does this is through the principles of association, which establishes relations among ideas. This creates a system out of a collection. Deleuze dismisses a nitpicky debate concerning the origin of relations. Someone could say that the property of ideas necessarily relates to other ideas, but Deleuze says that a true judgment is not a tautology, meaning A meaningful truth statement does not restate something in different terms, which would be an analytical truth. Synthesis requires the merging of distinct ideas which do not contain each other. So the externality of relations guarantees a subject who synthesizes. Hence the statement, quote, relations are external to their terms. Hume does distinguish between two kinds of relations. The first is relations which can be changed, but the ideas don't change. These relations include causality, time and space, and identity, and these are relations which are all external. An example of these types of relations would be a tree and a house, which are ideas can be positioned in different times and space, which are relations, but still maintain the integrity of their ideas. The second type of relations are those which entirely depend on the ideas, so a change in an idea changes the relation. These include resemblance, contrariety, degrees of quality, and quantity, which all appear to be internal. An example of these dependent relations would be the resemblance of a painting to a house that you're seeing right before you. The relation between painting and house is internal to those ideas. Kant believed these types of internal relations were Hume's mathematics, a system of analytical judgment. But Deleuze defends Hume. It is still maintained that relations are external to their ideas. Deleuze picks out a sentence of Hume describing the mathematical relation of equals, equality. It is not a property of the objects, but it is still a comparison which the mind makes. How does Deleuze maintain this? Well, rather than relations being interior, they are actually just a difference in the scope of externality. What this means is as such. Ideas are external, but they can be compared either collectively or individually. Spatial and temporal relations compare an idea to a collection of ideas. As Deleuze puts it, quote, spatial and temporal relations, such as distance, contiguity, anteriority, posteriority, etc., give us, in diverse forms, the relation of a variable object with the totality within which it is integrated, or with the structure where its mode of appearance situates it. End quote. Compare this to relations which are presumed to be internal, which, if you remember, means the relation is dependent on the idea. So the relation is not inflicted on an idea from without, but is inside the idea, which leads to another idea. However, Deleuze says these types of relations compare the characteristics of individual ideas rather than the collective. Quote, resemblance in the narrow sense of the term compares qualities, proportions compare quantities, the degree of quality compares intensities. End quote. So these relations, which appear to be internal to an idea, are still external. It's the comparison between the individual characteristics of ideas, and as such, it still requires a synthesis. Deleuze says, quote, the indivisibility of ideas does not explain that the unities constituted by them can be added, subtracted, made equal, or that they can enter into a system of operations. And further still, he says, the relation always presupposes a synthesis, and neither the idea nor the mind can account for it. End quote. Now Deleuze circles back to before this exposition of the externality of relations. Relations are effects of the principles of association. They naturalize the mind and give constancy to it. Quality is a result of the principle of association, not of an idea in and of itself. The principles of association qualify the collection of impressions and ideas that is the mind. Quote, only human nature is qualificatory. A collection of ideas will never explain how the simple ideas are regularly grouped into complex ideas. End quote. And complex ideas are in a reciprocal constituting relationship with the subject. Quote, this relation, or rather this intimacy between complex ideas and the subject, such that one is the inverse of the others, is presented to us in language. The subject, as she speaks, designates in some way which ideas are in turn designated to her. End quote. So we're finished, right? We've discussed how time, the organism, and the mind are transformed by the subject. But at the very end, Deleuze throws a curveball. Association, though it accounts for relations, is still not alone in synthesis. Deleuze says, quote, let us say that it explains AB equals BC, but it does not explain that A equals C. End quote. After all that has been modeled and said, what else could there be to complete synthesis? Let's explain one last puzzle piece. Hume says that association explains a natural relation, but it doesn't explain a philosophical relation. Nature makes easy and quick connections between things. If there are any mediations through which it must be squeezed, it loses its vivacity. Quoting Hume, quote, "Where the mind reaches not its objects with easiness and facility, the same principles have not the same effect as in more natural conception of the ideas, nor does the imagination feel a sensation which holds any proportion with that which arises from its common judgments and opinions." End quote. What this criticism is getting at is the fact that association is pretty kind of vague. One would be hard-pressed to find an idea that does not in some way resemble another. Where does the sharpness of particularities come into play with associationism? Deleuze quotes Bergson here, and I take the concluding point to show you what this all means. Quote, "What we really need to discover is how a choice is effected among an infinite number of recollections which all resemble in some way the present perception, and why only one of them, this rather than that, emerges into the light of consciousness." End quote. Deleuze agrees with Bergson, but first he gives credit to Hume. Deleuze believes that Hume's empiricism is an excellent account for, quote, "habits of thought, everyday notions of good sense, current ideas, and complexes of ideas which correspond to the most general and most constant need common to all minds and all languages." End quote. But what this does not account for is the particularities. Why does this specific thought come to mind for one person while it differs for another? Why this idea here and now in this particular time? Deleuze answers, circumstance. Circumstance is the driver of Hume's model of associationism. Without circumstance, which is individual and particular, there also can't be a science of human nature, that is, particular. Quote, "Understood in this way, a set of circumstances always individuates a subject since it presents a state of its passions and needs, an allocation of its interests, a distribution of its belief and exhilarations." End quote. Deleuze declares, without the principles of the passions, the principles of associationism are too general. They must be included for the subject to be constituted within the mind. The principles of the passions explain why one idea is preferred over another at a given point. Although the principles of the passions individuate the subject, they do not stand for an opposition with the universal. The principles of the passions are also universal with the principles of association. Finally, Deleuze says, if relations cannot be separated from the particular, this makes subjectivity essentially practical. Subjectivity is not theoretical. Remember this, theory follows from practice. Chapter 6, Principles of Human Nature, and Conclusion, Purposiveness. Deleuze begins this chapter by reproaching so-called philosophical critiques which completely sidestep the problem of philosophers attempting to solve, by dismissing that philosopher for some underlying basis, such as their particular tastes, or the spirit of their time, or perhaps their personal views. Quote, "Atomism and associationism are therefore treated as shifty projects which disqualify ab initio those who form them." End quote. Philosophical theory is not just for fun or responses to a set of interesting questions, nor is it an endeavor to tie up loose ends to ground philosophy. That would be science. Deleuze says this, "A philosophical theory is an elaborately developed question and nothing else. By itself and in itself, it is not the resolution to a problem, but the elaboration to the very end of the necessary implications of a formulated question. It shows us what things are or what things should be on the assumption that the question is good and rigorous." End quote. By putting something to question, it means subordinating all these things to the question with the hope of finding an essence. By critiquing a question, a person hopes to show how things could be different if the question was put a different way. Philosophy is about tracing the development of a question and seeing what sort of weight these developments have when we're done. When people say, "Hey, wait a minute, that's not how things are," that's beside the point. Deleuze says, it is a matter of knowing whether the question which presents things in such a light is good or not, rigorous or not. Deleuze is not ignoring the sociological forces that motivate a person to take up a question, far from it, but it does tell us whether a question is good or not. Now, the Kantian tradition defines the mission of Hume's empiricism to derive knowledge from experience, but Deleuze disagrees. Knowledge is not the most important aspect for empiricism. Knowledge is the means for practical activity. First, if experience is a collection of distinct perceptions, the relations which put them together are derived from principles of human nature which allow a subject to transcend experience. And if experience is just constant conjunction, again, the principles are derived from outside. Empiricism is better suited in terms of a dualism. The dualism between terms and relations, causes of perception and causes of relations, powers of hidden nature, and the principles of human nature. So a non-empiricist theory is that in which relations are derived from the nature of things. X necessarily derives from Y. So there is a harmony, a purpose between powers at the origin of the given and the principles that constitute a subject. A real metaphysics comes in. Kant recognized this and criticized associationism from this point of view. The imagination is the centerpiece of empiricism, not the senses. For Hume, the imagination becomes a faculty when it is able to synthesize ideas as the result of principles. But Kant criticizes Hume for this reason. Hume's dualism necessitates an agreement between the given and the subject, between nature and human nature. What this means is that through the imagination and habit, impressions from the outside, from nature, are made into a coherent world. This means that there is nothing in nature which necessarily guarantees that this will occur. It is accidental. So what Kant does is say that nature must conform to an a priori structure of the imagination. Quote, we must relate the given to the subject, conceive the agreement as an agreement of the given with the subject, and of nature with the nature of reasonable beings. End quote. The given is not a thing in itself, but a collection of phenomena, the byproduct of the subject. Relations for Kant are contained within the objects of appearance. So then, Hume must invoke purpose between nature and human nature. Let's see how the principles of passion have to do with all of this. Principles act in the mind, subjectivity is an impression of reflection. But in the impression of reflection, certain impressions are chosen among others. The principle of passions insert themselves between the mind and the subject to give weight to certain passions. The principle of passions chooses the impressions of pleasure and pain. What this is saying is that nature alone may endow the mind with the ability to make associations, but the problem of particularity comes into play. Where does specificity come into play? It's here, through the intervention of the principles of passions. This chapter proceeds by marking out the applicability of the principle of passions to general and abstract ideas. I cannot lie, this chapter, but especially these pages, were the most difficult in the entire book. As I proceed in my reading of Deleuze, maybe this particular spot requires a rereading. I apologize for the abruptness with which I must plead ignorance, but this is the place in which I must defer to more knowledgeable readers. When all is said and done, though, the principles of passions come out on top of the principles of association. The principles of association make possible the subject, but then the principles of the passions give inertia to the practical activity of the subject. Allow me to quote from Deleuze. Quote, the relations find their direction and their sense in the passions. Association presupposes projects, goals, intentions, occasions, an entire practical life and affectivity. Given particular circumstances and the needs of the moment, the passions are capable of replacing the principles of association because the principles do not select impressions of sensation without having already been submitted themselves to the necessities of practical life and to the most general and most constant needs. Hume must first be a moralist and a sociologist. From necessity, utility, the subject emerges from the given. The principles of association link ideas in the mind like a network of channels. Imagination becomes reason and finds constancy. But Hume reminds us not to confuse relations and direction. Morality would not be possible from association alone. Where does priority stem from? Relations give possibility, but where does the actualization come from? Quote, there is action only through sense or direction, and morality is like action. End quote. The mind becomes fixated, making certain impressions the end of activity. Quote, it is no longer a matter of fixed relations, but of centers of fixation. End quote. This is the principle of utility. Some impressions are pleasurable and some painful, which become ultimate ends. Action is the organization of means to ends, and this includes causality. Means are the causes and ends are the effects. Before the causes to become means, the effect must interest us, so the effect must be posited. The effect is considered good, and the subject must have a tendency to be able to cause the effect. So it is useful to create causality. The tendency to be able to cause an effect is a result of the reflection of impressions and of the passions. To be able to create good in a particular circumstance. Human qualities like anger, prudence, audacity, discretion are character traits which may or may not agree with a circumstance. The utility which organizes means and ends also relates individuals to historical situations. Quote, Utilitarianism is as much an evaluation of historical acts as it is a theory of instrumental action. End quote. Not only are things useful, but so are passions, feelings, and character. Morality is not concerned with the utility of things, but in a specific way for the utility of character, which also gives another argument for why morality is not dependent upon reason to motivate action. The imagination makes connections, reason corrects and guides, and the passions push. Together, these make the subject. Quote, to transcend is always to move from the known to the unknown. Unquote. This is what is called schematicism of the mind, or general rules. General rules are always extensive. Knowledge is the relation of parts to each other such that one part can be determined by referencing another. Deleuze says this, quote, one of Hume's most important ideas, one that he will use particularly against the possibility of any cosmology or theology, is that there is no intensive knowledge. All possible knowledge is extensive and between parts. Unquote. This schematicism of the mind consists of matters of fact and relations of ideas, though they are both extensive. The difference between these is proof and certainty. Proof relates to probability and is associated with physics. Certainty is taking two ideas and producing another idea and is associated with mathematics. But this schematicism of knowledge is not only extensive in how it reaches from one part to another, but it's also excessive. It's excessive in that some impressions are vivid, and its vividity is not derived from rules or principles, but from the imagination. This vividity allows the selection of particular relations, but it is necessary that these ideas be constant and invariable. Impressions can create mirages, which, with the aid of the passions and dispositions of a given moment, reinforce these illegitimate beliefs. Luckily, rules are corrected by rules within the imagination and understanding. At the heart of the subject is fantasy in constant correction. Now to turn to the passions. The principles of passions allow us to give way to associations. Included is the example of Nero committing patricide. The principle of passions resonate within the mind by reacting to the invented totality of circumstances in which it is located. This is how general interest is created. Quote, it is the resonance within the imagination of the particular interest in the movement of a passion that transcends its own partiality. Unquote. So we get a general rule to that we can call good or bad, and thus we can condemn Nero. So then, the subject transcends the given through belief and invention. Deleuze ends by saying this, quote, philosophy must constitute itself as the theory of what we are doing, not as a theory of what there is. What we do has its principles, and being can only be grasped as the object of a synthetic relation with the very principles of what we do. Hey, thank you so much for listening. I know that was a lot, and I apologize near the end. It got really rocky. The final chapter is very difficult. But hey, if you'll stick with me, then we're in this adventure together. We're in this journey, and I hope to read more Deleuze in the future. If any of you guys have any notes or comments or anything, feel free to comment them. But yeah, the next episode that we do should be the Hume podcast. So make sure to stay around for that. Thank you, everybody, and I'll catch you later. Bye-bye.